What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be talking about another engineer build that is a pretty good generalist build for basically anybody trying to use the engineer in essentially any situation you can think of. It has a little bit of single target damage, a little bit of crowd control, and a lot of flavor and spice built into it, and it has been a build that I have been really enjoying using for some time now. So if you guys are ready, let's talk about the fine details and setup of the explosive operative build for the engineer class in DeepRockGalactic. By the way, if you want to see more build videos or just more videos in general, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so that way you never miss another upload. So the basic overview surrounding this build is it's actually one of the most brain dead and simple to use builds that I have put together. When making this build, I didn't really want to have something that was too complicated or required too much thought process, and I kind of just wanted something that the engineer could use very easily without really thinking too much. That being said, even if you do have that mindset, you will still be very effective with this build, and it will do wonders at both cleaning up big groups of enemies and even taking out bigger, tougher threats to a good degree. The idea is we use a combination of our Lock 1 smart rifle with its explosive chemical rounds overclock and the breach cutter with the Inferno overclock to basically just destroy any major group of enemies that comes our way, as well as being able to take chunks out of the bigger threats that come towards us. The Lock 1 smart rifle, or the Loki rifle as I like to call it, makes this build very easy for people to use because the Loki rifle literally does the aiming for you. You just point and aim and the gun will literally fire the bullets at the targets that you want without even you having to think about it. And with the explosive chemical rounds overclock we are using, it is going to do wonders at taking out the enemy swarms, provided you don't go overboard and overlock on certain enemies because you don't want to be burning too many shots, since you only want to have up to 3 locks on one particular target. That being said, this is great for taking out those big groups of enemies at a distance or just those individual threats that you want to pick off very quickly, and provided the enemies get close to you, which is a pretty big if, then you just have the breach cutter with the Inferno overclock, which is probably one of the most effective crowd clearing tools in the entire game, as well as decently good at taking out bigger, tougher threats. Again, the idea behind this build is we want to have as simple of a gameplay loop as humanly possible and not really think too much about what we're doing, and instead just lay into the enemies with extreme amounts of efficiency. That being said, when talking about the actual gameplay of the build itself, there's really not too many things to talk about, as this build can really do just about anything decently well to a good degree. I know I say that sometimes about a lot of the builds that I put up, but this one in particular is just really good at essentially anything you can think of. It's really good at swarm control, so things like point extraction missions or on-site refining or basically any type of holdout defense missions are really effective with this build. And it's also really good on mobile type missions such as escort duty or even deep scans, because it's really good when the enemy is funneled into a situation where they have to move towards you. One specific thing this build surprised me in is its effectiveness against dreadnoughts, since the biggest amount of damage that we have is obviously the breach cutter, and since we're using Inferno and the dreadnoughts are really hard to light on fire unless you have some sort of accelerant to it, like the Scout's Drac plasma carbine, I wasn't really sure how this was going to work against dreadnoughts since they cannot be lit on fire by conventional means, so I figured that we were going to be losing a lot of our DPS and power against them. That being said, the build actually did pretty well, I guess just because I completely underestimated just how strong the breach cutter is. I say this a lot, but the breach cutter is one of the most effective and powerful secondary weapons in the entire game. Even if you have something on it like the Inferno, which is an overclock that actually takes away damage from it in order to give it the burning effect, it is still incredibly powerful even against enemies that it has a hard time lighting on fire. That being said, against enemies that it can light on fire, even though the fact that we are using Inferno and taking away some of its damage, it is still incredibly strong and can clear waves even on Has 5 like it's nothing. We basically have this thing built out to be able to just take care of the gigantic swarms as they get close to you. And when they're at a distant threat and before they get close to you, we then have our trusty Lock 1 smart rifle with the explosive chemical rounds. I don't think this overclock really needs any introduction. Anybody who knows the Loki rifle knows that the explosive chemical rounds are really good, but basically what it does is it makes it so that way whenever you have at least 3 locks on a target, once you release the burst, when the last bullet hits the target, they will explode and deal a big area damage around them, and this can happen multiple times per magazine. So basically every target that you have at least 3 locks on will cause a big burst of damage to not only itself but anything else caught in the explosive radius. Now normally I don't specifically talk about the mods that I use in DeepRock, and I actually have plans to make a whole video talking about mods in the future as well as which ones I am particularly using, but I figured one that I should at least showcase on this particular build, since you're going to be seeing it all in the background gameplay, is Better Lock Indicator. This is a easy verified mod that you can install that basically just makes it so that way what you're seeing on on screen where sometimes the lock icon will change to green, this basically lets you know that you have enough locks on the target to achieve whatever you're trying to achieve. In this case, it is triggering the explosive chemical round. That's why in the background gameplay, you're seeing some of the locks turn to green, because that is the mod telling me that, hey, this target has enough locks on them that you can release and get the explosive lock to trigger. It's a useful mod, and if you want to check it out, I'll have a link to it in the description. That way you can check it out for yourself if you are on the Steam version, that is. If you're on the console version, I'm sorry. I don't know how you're going to be able to do something like this, but if you don't have access to it, or if you don't want to use it, you just have to keep a mental note of what you're locking onto. All of this basically translates to this build being especially good at crowd control, but also very good at single target damage to a good degree, because the explosions from the explosive chemical rounds can do good chunk damage, and again, like I said before, the breach cutter is just insanely powerful and capable of doing heavy damage, even though we are using an overclock that physically nerfs its damage output. Next, talking about the actual loadout of the build, first we have our perk choices, and for this, I'm not really going with anything too crazy or wild compared to what I normally use. I'm going with the standard holy trinity that I like to go with, which is Resupplier, Born Ready, and Thorns, but you could probably go with some more options if you wanted to experiment a bit with things like Sweet Tooth, and maybe even Vampire if you wanted to, because that could work well with one of our active perks. And talking about our active perks, we are of course running the dynamic duo of Dash and Iron Will, but you could obviously use basically any combination of active perks that you want to use. Dash, I would say, is pretty useful in this build for helping us get away from groups of enemies, but you could also go with something like Field Medic or even Beastmaster if you did want to do that as well. Then going into our weapons and equipment, first we of course have our throwable grenade, and for this build you really don't need to use any specific type of grenade. There's not going to be one that specifically makes this build even better or significantly more powerful, so really it's up to your full discretion as to what you want to use. For me, I just like the very simple and effective SSGs. I use them all the time. The fact that they're one of the few grenades that literally cannot do friendly fire damage is really nice, but another option would be the plasma bursters. If you wanted to go full damage output, that would also be an option for you as well. Then moving on to the weapons themselves, our primary weapon is of course the aforementioned Loki Smart Rifle or Lock 1 Smart Rifle. This is the weapon that basically allows us to turn our brain off and basically just hold down the trigger and take out the big groups of enemies, especially the groups that are really far away and in troublesome locations, because thanks to the tracking of the bullets, we can hit them from some cheeky angles that we otherwise wouldn't necessarily be able to. This is of course our bread and butter mid to long range weapon that is capable of picking off those individual threats as well as those moderately sized groups of enemies that are coming towards us. And of course we are running the aforementioned and very popular explosive chemical rounds. As I explained, this makes it so that way whenever you have at least 3 locks on a target, after you release the locks, they will explode, dealing area damage to any target that has more than 3 locks on them. This is of course at the cost of a lower overall damage output and less ammo. The less ammo and overall damage output is not really that big of a deal for us, as we compensate for it decently well. And this just gives us so much crowd control and so much damage output. Even with the reduced damage, we can still do some pretty heavy amounts of damage to anything coming towards us. Again, since I am using the mod, like I mentioned earlier, all I have to do is see the line turn green, and that's how you know you can release, and you'll know you'll at least get 1 explosion off. But if not, all you have to do is just keep looking for the number 3 or higher, and once you see that, just let go and you know you'll get some explosions. And this can even do decently well against bigger threats like Dreadnoughts or Praetorians and Oppressors if you just burst fire the weapon. Anytime you go past 3, just let go and release the explosion, then do it again and again, and it basically turns the Loki rifle into a burst rifle, which can be pretty good as well, especially with handling the lower ammo. Now, to make the Loki rifle a little bit better with this particular overclock, for our upgrades in tier 1, I chose the extra ammo just to help compensate for the overclock a little bit. In the second tier, I took the CCD array just to give us a little bit better acquisition for our locks. In tier 3, I chose the electrochemical rounds because since we are going to be able to apply fire to a lot of our enemies, as well as electrocution effects, which are relatively common amongst all the classes, especially with the Loki itself, as we'll talk about later, this can give us a good amount of damage output as well. In tier 4, I'm choosing the aperture extension just to give us even more locks, that way we can get more explosive triggers. And then lastly, in tier 5, I am choosing the electric generator mod because it combos very, very well with explosive chemical round. This basically makes it so that way any target that also has 3 locks on it, similar to the explosive chemical rounds, are electrocuted by the first bullet that hits them, causing a electric damage over time effect and also slows them down. Now, this combos very, very well with the explosive chemical rounds and the electrochemical rounds that we have in tier 3, because since the first shot will electrocute them, the other 2 shots from the electrochemical rounds will do extra damage, and then the last round will deal explosive damage thanks to the explosive chemical rounds. That was a lot of rounds in one sentence, and I apologize, but basically it means that each burst of damage that you put on an enemy is going to electrify them, deal extra damage, and then blow them up all in order, which is kind of crazy. This means that although yes, we do have less damage with the explosive chemical rounds, we are more than making up for it with our mod choices. Now, to help compensate for it, especially when the enemies get up close and personal and when we want to give ourselves a little bit of breathing room, we are of course using one of my favorite weapons in the entire game, which is the Breach Cutter. Breach Cutter needs no introduction. It is a very, very powerful weapon taken straight out of Isaac Clarke's locker, as it just basically flings a line of electricity that can deal very heavy damage and also pass through terrain, making it really easy to hit your targets even if you don't have clear line of sight. And as I said, we are using the Inferno overclock with the Breach Cutter, which makes it so that way the line has the ability to light enemies on fire at the cost of lower damage output and less damage to armor. Both of those things we really don't necessarily care about, since the Breach Cutter has the ability to essentially pass through armor very effectively. You really don't need to worry too much about the armor drop off, and the lack of damage itself, again, does not really apply too much because the Breach Cutter already does an insane amount of damage. And when you're adding fire on top of it, it just makes it so that way that damage drop off is practically non-existent. This is the thing that we use when enemies are right in front of us in very large groups, or if you just want to slay out on massive groups of enemies no matter what. It doesn't have as crazy amount of range as the Smart Rifle. This is more of a close to mid-range weapon, at least with the particular setup that we have to it, but in those particular circumstances, it can be incredibly devastating. And again, it can chew through even the big threats like Oppressors and Praetorians and even Dreadnoughts to a decent degree. Yes, you're not going to be able to light them on fire, but just the way we have it set up, and again, just the Breach Cutter by itself, is really, really strong at taking these guys out. And to make the Breach Cutter even stronger with our overclock, we are taking the high capacity mags in tier 1 to give us even more shots to work with. You could go with the prolonged power generator to make it last a little bit longer, give it a little bit more range if you wanted to, but me, I just like reloading as little as possible, so that's why I went with that. In tier 2, I chose the expanded ammo bags to give us even more shots to work with, but if you really do want to make it have as much firepower as possible, you could go with the condensed plasma to give it more DPS if you really wanted to, but I really didn't think that the damage drop-off was too noticeable, so I just gave us as many shots as we possibly could. Then in tier 3, I have quick deploy just to make it so that way the line comes out quicker. I really don't think the reload time is that bad on the Breach Cutter by default. And again, since we are running Born Ready, we won't really be reloading that often manually, so I don't really think that we necessarily need that. In tier 4, I picked the disruptive frequency tuning to give us a stun chance. This is really, really good, especially with Inferno, because the enemy is going to be just stunned and then lit on fire, which means they're just going to be standing there on fire, taking damage and not really be able to do anything. So this is really, really good. And again, the armor breaking isn't really what we're going for, so I don't really think you need to go with that one. And then in tier 5, you really could go either the plasma trail or the triple split line. But personally, I really like the plasma trail because it also makes fire damage on the trail that it leaves behind, which again, our Smart Rifle can capitalize on with some of its mod choices. And it also just helps to give us a little bit more area denial. Again, you could tweak a couple of things about the Breach Cutter, but for me, I just wanted to have as many shots to work with as possible, since again, the Breach Cutter by itself just already does so much damage, even when you are limiting it with the Inferno overclock, that I really don't think you need too many crazy damage increasing mods to make it even stronger, and the ones we do have help to coincide with our primary weapons as well. And then briefly going over the rest of equipment for our engineer. For the platform gun, we are working with a very simple setup with just expanded ammo bags in tier 1 and the repellent additive in tier 3. For the sentry gun, you can really go with either option you want in tier 1. You can either go with the Gemini system or the LMG Mark II. I just personally like to use the LMG Mark II because I'm lazy and I don't want to set up 2 sentry guns and walk back and forth between them, but if you want to be optimal for damage, the Gemini is probably better. And I'm also using quick deploy in tier 2 for the same reasons. I just want to spend as little time as possible building these sentry guns, but if you really wanted to, you could probably go for more ammo and get overall more DPS out of it. Then I'm taking stun in tier 3, that way this thing can basically be a hard crowd control tool as well and can sort of help slow down the swarms attacking us. And then lastly, Hawkeye system in tier 4, just because I like it when my turret can hit anything no matter what, and I don't have to worry about the angle in which I place it. Again, I'm going for as little brain power as possible with this build. And then finally, for our armor rig, we have the standard setup of improved generator in tier 1, healthy in tier 2, and breathing room in tier for. So give me my final thoughts on this build. Again, as I said in the beginning, this is a build that I kind of want to be sort of autopilot to a degree. I don't want it to be something where you have to think too heavily about. The only real thing you do kind of have to think about, especially if you don't have access to the mods, is knowing when to use the explosive chemical rounds and when to actually let go. But it's really not that big of a deal, especially once you get used to it. If you're somebody who has used the explosive chemical rounds in the past, you probably are already used to it. And if you have never used it before, it really does not take that long to figure out. And aside from that, this is just a very good generalist build for essentially any type of mission. Again, you might be able to tweak the breach cutter a little bit, maybe not necessarily take Inferno for the Dreadnought missions, maybe swap that out for something else. You could even go just the stronger plasma current, the clean overclock, just to give you a little bit more DPS to help you out with the Dreadnoughts since you can't light them on fire. But aside from that, this build can really handle just about anything that you will come across. And even if you don't have access to the overclocks mentioned in this particular build, you can still use this build relatively well, even with these weapons just by themselves, and it will still do wonders for you. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this build video for the engineer. I have a couple more build videos that I have planned out, and this one was a lot of fun and very, very spicy, to say the least. Let me know what you guys thought about this. Let me know what kind of changes you would make, if you would make any changes at all. And let me know what type of build you guys are liking to play right now. Or if you want to see any other type of build covering a specific overclock or class, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Anyway, I hope you guys found this video informative and entertaining. If you did, please be sure to let me know by hitting that like button and consider subscribing and becoming a member today, as it really helps out the channel a lot. Rocket Stone Miners, I will see you in the next video.